Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into an ancient text, but we're not just reading it as a standard religious narrative. No, we're looking at it as a truly fascinating historical record of a brand new king aggressively centralizing his power. We're talking about the famous story of King David fetching the Ark of the Covenant, and we're going to view this entirely through the objective lens of a historian. Because, when you peel back the layers of this ancient account, what you actually find is a total masterclass in political theater, logistics, and the incredibly high stakes of ancient leadership. So, here's our roadmap for how this high-stakes political drama unfolds. We'll start with David's initial bid for centralized power, followed by a fatal protocol breach. Then, we'll look at a strategic 3-month pause, the king's triumphant, carefully choreographed dance, and finally, the ultimate dynastic fracture. Let's get right into it. Kicking things off with part 1, a bid for centralized power as David makes his move to bring the Ark to Jerusalem. According to the ancient chronicler, David didn't just quietly sneak this religious artifact into the city in the middle of the night. Not at all. He gathered an astounding 30,000 chosen men. Just think about that scale for a second. This is a massive, highly unified show of military and political force. He is making absolutely sure everyone knows he has the sheer numbers and the military backing to command the entire nation. And geographically? Well, this was a brilliantly calculated move. We can actually trace the Ark's physical journey right from the very fringes of the territory straight into the beating heart of David's new stronghold. It kicks off at Abinadab's house in Gibeah, hits a massive crisis point at Nashon's threshing floor, pauses for 3 whole months at Obed-Edom's house, and then finally arrives in the city of David. What we are really tracking here is the literal map of decentralized power being pulled tightly and forcefully into the monarchy's grip. Which brings us to part 2, the fatal protocol breach and the absolute disaster at Nachshon's threshing floor. Now picture the setup for this first attempt. It is a grand, noisy, incredibly visible procession. We're talking harps, ancient lutes, tambourines, cymbals, the whole shebang. The Ark itself is placed on a shiny new cart driven by Uzzah and Ahio. But despite all this grand musical pomp, a completely mundane little stumble by the oxen causes a massive disruption. Uzzah instinctively reaches out to steady the Ark, and for this single error, the historical text records that he is immediately struck dead. Just like that, this massive, unstoppable political parade grinds to a horrifying halt. The text tells us David was displeased. Actually, displeased is probably an understatement. But in a truly fascinating maneuver, he immediately names the site Perez Uzzah, which translates to the breach of Uzzah. By doing this, he's forever marking the physical landscape with the memory of this disastrous attempt. He literally cements the failure right into the local geography. Right after this, the text explicitly notes that David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he asks this profound, searching question: how shall the Ark of the Lord come to me? This is a crucial pivot point for the new king. He realizes the brute force of 30,000 men and a shiny new cart just wasn't enough. He desperately needs an entirely new strategy if he's actually going to successfully centralize this power. Moving on to part 3, a strategic 3-month pause and recalibrating at Obed-Edom's house. So, facing what is essentially a massive public relations and religious disaster, David absolutely refuses to bring the Ark into his city right then. Instead, he diverts it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, where it just sits for 3 full months. Effectively, guys, this is a strategic test run. The text notes that the Lord blessed Obed-Edom's household, and when word of this undeniable blessing makes its way back to David, well, it proves the artifact is finally safe to move again. The divine anger has seemingly subsided. The stark contrast between these two approaches perfectly illustrates the sheer logistics of ancient political theater. Just think about it. That first attempt relied on a new cart driven by oxen, a relatively casual, highly efficient mode of transport that completely backfired. The second attempt, it's a total 180-degree pivot. David shifts entirely from efficiency to an intensely cautious, highly ritualized progression. The Ark is carried by human bearers this time, and they are literally stopping to sacrifice oxen and fattened calves every 6 paces. 6 paces. It's a deliberate, massive slowing down of the entire process to ensure absolute, unquestionable compliance.
And that perfectly sets the stage for Part 4, the king's triumphant dance, as they finally enter the city of David.
The text makes a point to specifically call out David's wardrobe here. It notes he is wearing a linen ephod. He very intentionally sheds the heavy, dignified, somewhat untouchable royal robes for this extremely simple, traditional, priestly garment. Historically speaking, this is a brilliantly calculated optical maneuver. He is visually aligning himself directly with the priesthood and with the common people. He's getting right down on their level. The procedure for this second attempt is heavily orchestrated. As we mentioned, the bearers advance just 6 paces before coming to a complete halt for sacrifices. Then, King David himself dances before the Lord with all his might, while the entire house of Israel brings the ark up with massive shouting and the blasting of trumpets. This highly visible, deeply systematic procedure ensures maximum public spectacle. It is completely designed to erase the dark shadow of that first failure.
And then, to completely solidify this massive political victory, David does something incredibly practical. Once all the offerings are wrapped up, he literally feeds his new base. He deals out a cake of bread, a good piece of meat, and a flagon of wine to every single man and woman in the multitude. I mean, it's brilliant. He sends absolutely everyone home fed, happy, and entirely loyal to his newly centralized regime.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, the final dynastic fracture, pitting the house of David against the old house of Saul. Now, this whole populist display, it creates an immediate, sharp fracture right within David's own household. As the grand procession enters the city, Michal is looking down through a window. She sees David leaping and dancing, and the text tells us she utterly despises him. Notice how the author pointedly refers to her as Michal, Saul's daughter. She is playing the bitter voice of the old, rigid royal dynasty, and she sarcastically mocks David for abandoning his royal dignity just to act like a commoner. Well, David's response is a brutal, calculated, political rebuttal. He doesn't apologize for a second. In fact, he doubles down. He explicitly reminds her that it was the Lord who chose him over her father Saul and over her entire house. He outright declares that he will be even more base in his own sight, and that the very maidservants she's looking down upon will actually hold him in honor. It is a crushing absolute assertion of his new dynastic supremacy. If we step back and tally up the final scorecard of this historical narrative, the winners and losers of this massive regime change are incredibly clear. Obed-Edom, blessed, along with his whole household. David successfully consolidates absolute power and is celebrated by the masses. On the losing end, poor Uzzah loses his life to a seemingly simple protocol error. And Michal, she loses her entire legacy. The text ends with the chillingly final historical note that she remained childless to the day of her death, which functionally and permanently ends her father's royal line. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with this to ponder. Looking strictly at the text from a historian's perspective, we clearly see the complex logistics of power, high-stakes crisis management, and the brutal realities of regime change. So, was David's journey simply an act of humble religious devotion, or was it the ultimate masterclass in ancient political theater and dynastic consolidation? It's definitely a fascinating way to read these ancient records, showing us just how incredibly complex the path to power truly was.